in the post-COVID world. And today, the topic is unclear science, navigating the nuclear post-war landscape. We have two distinguished speakers. So let me introduce, perhaps lady first, right? Professor Hsiu-Yun Wang, and Professor Zwigenberg, right, from Penn State University. And Professor Hsiu-Yun Wang is a historian of science, and she is currently the head of another department, right? Oh, by the way, my name is Harry Wu, okay. I am associate professor at Cross College Elite Program at this university. And another department is Department of Medical Humanities and Social Medicine at the Faculty of Medicine. And Hsiu-Yun was a biologist before becoming a historian of science. She earned her PhD from Department of History of Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she had already published many articles on the history of a wide range of gender-related medical issues, such as sex education and hysterectomy, etc., etc. And now her focus is on the history of nuclear medicine in post-war Taiwan. And Ran is an old friend of mine, and his research focuses on modern Japanese and European history, with a specialization in memory and cultural history. He has taught and lectured in the United States, different places in Europe, Israel, and Japan, and he speaks perfect Japanese, we just heard, right? And he already published on issues of war memory, heritage, atomic energy, psychiatry, and survival politics. Rand's first book, Hiroshima, The Origins of Global Memory Culture, was published by Cambridge University Press 10 years ago exactly, right? And he was the winner of 2016 Association for Asian Studies John Hall Book Award. And his second book is Japan's Castle, Citadels of Modernity in War and Peace, and it was published also with Cambridge University Press. We just had a tour on our campus, and we just helped Rand to find another project of his. He's going to, he's so curious about all the architecture on our campus, all these military barracks left behind by the Japanese military. Anyway, but today we're going to talk about, Ryan is going to speak about his latest book called Nuclear Minds. We won't, I won't go into details because Rand is going to speak about it, and the entire book is open access online, right? So if you're interested, you don't need to buy it, right? And we're going to speak, each speaker will be speaking for 20 minutes, and before we open up for questions and answers. So, and students, if you are curious about anything, don't be afraid, throw your questions out, okay? Ran.
Thank you. It's on, yeah. Okay, this is actually, I need the second one. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you, Hari, for inviting me. I thank you, Charlene, for coming to join me today, and thank the department and university for really for generosity for bringing me here to Tainan to be in this beautiful building that I'm very, very curious about. But today I'm not going to talk about buildings, but on people and people psych. So I'm going to talk about my latest solo book, Nuclear Minds. You can see the cover here. And about the problem of trauma and PTSD in the nuclear context. Now, my book starts, I want to start with two places on a timeline where my book takes place. My book takes place within mostly a 20 years span between 1945 and 1965, where I examine the reaction of the psychological sciences to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and to nuclear age as a whole. Now, the beginning of the book, not the actual book, but the timeline, is in November 1945, where you have the first time the psychologists come to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and interview survivors. To my great amazement, you have those people, actually it's fitting that I have this, right? Going around with clipboards after their country dropped an atomic bomb on this city. They're going around the city, psychologists and sociologists and social scientists, and ask the resident, how did you feel about it, basically? How was the experience, right? And I have some of the questions here in Romanized Japanese and in English. What have you thought about the A-bomb, right? What bombing experience have you personally had? Can you tell us more about those experiences? And so on and so on. This is their romanization. It's not very good. And this scene was kind of mind-blowing for me. I mean, the rudeness, the unrealness, uncanniness of this idea of dropping a bomb and then asking people how they felt about it. I mean, this is the puzzlement and actually almost anger about this, right? Those people were just victimized by the US, and US immediately turned into making them some kind of psychological guinea pigs, right? Was basically the start of the book. Like, what is going on here? Why are those people, why are those people there? How they got there? And what led to this moment? So, this moment and from this moment, right? So I start looking at, well, sorry. No, I was looking for this actually. Thank you. I start looking for more work on psychology, happened afterwards, but I could not find a lot. I could not find many people who work on this. What I realized is that from this moment until 1962, the psychiatrist Robert Lifton come to Hiroshima. There's almost no one in Hiroshima, with the exception of this guy, Kubashitoshi, and some other people, that work on this. So in 1962, a Jewish-American psychiatrist, Robert Lifton, is Jewish and it's important, come to Hiroshima, meet a psychologist named Kubashitoshi, and the meeting doesn't really go very well. But Robert Lifton goes out and write a book about the experience of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which lead him to develop the idea, I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, the idea of psychological numbness, traits of the guilt, survivor guilt, traits of the survivor, and all the stuff that will eventually lead to PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Lifton sat on the committee that wrote the syndrome into the DSM, the manual, diagnostic manual of the American Psychiatric Association. Now, he is very well known in the world of psychiatry. Kubashitoshi, those psychologists who were on the ground in 1945, are not. So my book basically set out to see what happened before Lifton, right? It's basically a prehistory of PTSD. And that's the whole point of the book, I realized. I didn't know at the beginning. When you write a book, you actually eventually realize that you start with the wrong assumptions. And I realized that what I was writing actually is going beyond trauma. So if Robert Lifton here is very important, sorry, I was supposed to show you this before, right? It's very important in the medicalization of pain, right? I wanted to go and see what happened before that, right? Oh, sorry. What happened before Lifton, right? Sorry, I went ahead of my slides there. So nuclear minds, right, deal with 4 different parts that talk about what happened before. And today I'm going to talk only about 1.5 of them, right? Right? I'm going to talk about the main argument, which is about trauma and going beyond trauma. And then I'll talk about number and about the problem of objectivity, scientific objectivity, right? Number 3 here. And a little bit about number 4, what happened afterwards, right? So I have the next 15 minutes or so. I'm going to go through those 2.5 lines, starting with the main idea, which is going beyond the empire of trauma. The empire of trauma, not my phrase, I just love this phrase. It's a book, very important book by Didier Fassin and Richard Achman that talks about how trauma dominates our ideas of understanding mass violence and the effect of mass violence on society. What they call the empire trauma relates to the fact that we cannot think beyond the medical category. Even though mass violence is something that is experienced in a cultural level, right? As well as the medical level, social level, it has all those impacts, right? Yet we increasingly look at it through the prism of trauma and in the academy trauma studies. The idea that this is basically all really flatten the experience, and we have to look beyond that. And you have to look beyond that, both in time and space, cultural space. So different cultures understand pain and trauma differently, but also people before our time, before they had the category of trauma, and this is very common sense for medical history, right? The historical construction of medical categories, right? It's very common sense medical history, but because I look at it within a cultural context also, it's actually very destabilizing for people who believe and work according to the categories of trauma. So if you think about trauma through Ian Hacking, very famous idea of looping effect. Ian Hacking is a famous psychiatrist, philosopher of science, right? This idea that once you have the category of PTSD and trauma, then the experience, the modern experience, right, create people to understand their experiences as trauma, right? Once you go beyond that, you will see that people experience differently. So not only the medical profession understood it differently, people on the ground experience it differently. And what I basically argue, which again can be understood very controversial, is that people were not traumatized. Now, not because they didn't suffer psychological pain, but because they didn't understand their experiences as trauma. The medical profession did not see it as trauma. The medical profession did not deny it as trying to suppress it, even though some did, and I'm going to talk about it. The medical profession just could not see it. Denial here is a psychological category, right? There's another level here of not being able to see it as trauma because the trauma didn't exist. PTSD didn't exist, right? Again, maybe in the medical history level, this is not so groundbreaking, but if you take it out into the ethical, cultural, social, historical realm, it destabilized the idea of trauma studies. It asks the question, can you even talk about trauma in something like, there's a very recent book, for example, about the trauma of the forced migration of people into Taiwan. Forgot the name now. Gosh, it's such, but it won a prize. But this happened in 1949, 1950, right? 48, 49. So is this a trauma? Right, we can talk about it later. Okay, so once we establish the conceptual realm, let's go to case studies. And I'm going straight into number 3 here, objectivity. Why people did not see it as a trauma, and what did they see? And I want to start with a couple of quotes. With a quote from the chief psychiatrist of the Japanese army, Kamate Shirabe. This is from Nakamura's early work. Who says that unlike the Western militaries during the First World War, there has been no neurotic illness called war neurosis in the Japanese military. Since the present war, the Asia-Pacific War, that's my phrase, of course, broke out, I'm proud as a member of the military of the emperor that the fact shows people of the Japanese empire have especially high morale. So does this mean that the Japanese soldiers, what is he denying the fact that there are actual breakdown? Is he denying trauma, or maybe his ideological constraints, let's say, what he can and can't say, what he think and can't think, what he believe, he doesn't believe, lead him as a psychiatrist to see other things. And I would argue the latter, right? The latter, that basically Kamate here cannot see trauma. And it's not just because of psychiatry, the ideology of him as a soldier of the Japanese army in 1937 is also, in the case of Japanese imperial army psychiatry, a case of the particular history of psychiatry within Japan, which is very, very German. Very, very German. They write in German. They use a lot of German language. There's a lot of Germanized Japanese. It's kind of a mess to read. I'm going to give you an example in a second. And if you look at how they talk about people who suffer from what we now call trauma, you see they use very simple, very, very similar terms. So for example, the people who suffer from surgical syndromes after they're returning from war are actually not hurt because of the war. They are obsessed about their pensions, right? So they're pension neurotics. Pension meaning like compensation, right? What they call it here, like a hosho shinkeisho, the compensation neurosis. You have the same thing in German. Soldiers, German soldiers going back from World War I do not deserve any compensation or treatment. They are obsessed about their pension, right? About the rente neurotica. Very similar. Okay, this is just one case study. And if you go and you see it across the board, before and after the war, up until the 70s and 80s, if you look at psychiatry across the board, if you talk about soldiers, you talk about civilians, you talk about, in this case, Holocaust survivors, right? You don't see an acknowledgement of what we call PTSD trauma. So a case study very far away from Japan and East Asia, the case study of Holocaust survivors in Israel, right? In Israel, both people who are embedded within the Zionist, like Israeli patriotic Zionist medical establishment, and the German establishment ironically share the same idea about Holocaust survivors, right? That if they are sick, they're some kind of a danger to society. And if they're sick, it's because they were sick before the war. And that mental illness is a kind of a stigma. So for example, in 1950, there is a rumor that is a ship of fools, ship of medical patients coming to Israel. And we'll have to deal with this. We don't know how to deal with this, right? Psychiatrists like Leo Stroll, Fischel Schneerson, people who work in DP camps and in Israel, basically advocate that sick people are sick because they're in Europe. But once they come to Israel, the healthy environment of Zionist basically immune them from trauma. Okay, they can't be sick if they're in a healthy environment. And if you look at, those are very long quotes, I'm not going to read to you for the purpose of time, but basically in those quotes you see, and you can read here faster, and read to you that they have very ideological idea of what soldiers versus Holocaust survivors should experience. So people who are very ideologically committed, like Soviet soldiers or like Israeli soldiers during the war, will not have war neurosis or war problems. But people who went through the Holocaust, this is their problem. I mean, they were already problematic. They don't have the ideological kind of immunization from trauma, right? So they don't see trauma because of the psychiatric history and also the immunization, right? Now, this changes, I'm sorry, it's a little bit small here, when people actually start to take the patient seriously. When people start to think about patients as deserving compensation and treatment. And this changes in the 60s and 70s. So if before, both Israeli and also there's another one here from a German psychiatrist that said that there might be a mental development in this guy, he might be psychiatric unstable, right? But it has nothing to do with 1945. He was sick before, right? They actually use Freudian categories to deny trauma. They said it's a childhood trauma. It's not a camps, right? But once you have doctors like Paul Chodov, right, who see survivors as people who are kind of righteous people, people who suffer for a higher purpose, right, they start taking them seriously. And there's a struggle actually to have recognition and compensation for the victims, which leads eventually to recognition and changes. But this happened in the Holocaust case. Sorry, I'm just going to skip a couple of things. It doesn't happen in Japan, even though in Japan, and around the same time, you have the same idea about a survivor. So you see the very similar language, right? So our hibakusha are survivors. They're like the Christ. They bore the sins of the people of the world. So people put up the survivors of the Holocaust. People put up the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as people who are deserving some kind of a special treatment. They are survivors, they're not victims. In the case of the Holocaust, the ideological change lead to change in the medicine. In the case of Hiroshima, it doesn't happen. And in the last 4.5 minutes, okay, 5, okay. I don't want to take time from Professor Wang. So, okay, right, so where's the book? Let me read it to you. Read your passage. So, is what we established so far, right? So in a Holocaust case, ideological change lead to medical change, right? The recognition, right? In the Holocaust, in the Hiroshima case, it doesn't, right? I'm just going to skip this, right? Now, in the last part, I want to talk about why it doesn't, right? So, going back to the beginning, right? Lifton, right? To the beginning, Lifton, right? So Lifton here, right? He meet with Kobayashi Toshi, right? And and he write this book I talked about before, Death in Life, right? He started to develop this idea of the traits on a survivor, right? He started to develop the idea of psychic closure. He looked at survivors as in Hiroshima as a model for survivors everywhere. He makes the category of survivor medically universal. And this connects to his work on Vietnam veterans. He connects with Paul Chodov and the other people who work on the Holocaust stuff. It comes together, and eventually it will lead to PTSD, right? So this case, this is what happened, and I'm kind of rushing through because I want to go back to Hiroshima. So this connects to the development I said before about how the ideological change in the Holocaust case lead to change. Now, let's go back to Hiroshima. Sorry. So in Hiroshima, actually, there is no change. And the reason for it got to do with the history of care in Hiroshima, which got to do, it's pretty complex, got to do with who does this and who does the care. So the beginning of, there's two realms in people who deal with survivors, right? The psychiatrists who, as I said before, and psychologists do not acknowledge or give enough support for survivors. And then there are social workers. Mostly women, mostly survivors themselves, because care is seen as a gendered realm where women will provide care. And Yumi Kim just wrote a brilliant book about psychiatric care in Japan, which is mostly done by women at the home, right? Now, those women, ironically, also mostly work for American institutions, right? And their job in the beginning is actually somewhere between giving medical care and also gathering intelligence on the survivors for like peace activity and all sorts of stuff. This is very problematic, but it started to change in the 60s as a lot of those women and the generation to come afterwards, right, start to organize as there is radicalization in Japan following the anti-Vietnam War and other movement, and start to organize in social workers, women-led social workers organization, and they connect their work with anti-nuclear work. So again, we see ideological change, right? One of the main people who are important for this as thinker is a sociologist named Ishida Tadashi. And in 1976, he wrote about Lifton, right? And write that it is a shock to us that an American couldn't conduct such a research before us Japanese. But the reason is because he's Jewish, because he had the Holocaust, right? And then my ears hurt. What do you mean because he's Jewish, right? What he means here, right, is that the Holocaust experience, right, gave a model for Lifton to understand what's happening to the survivors, right? And he wished to build on this. However, in his case, the result was not an acknowledgement of psychological suffering, but an ideological transformation of the survivor. The politics are more important than the medicine here. He's not a psychologist, he's not a psychiatrist, he's a sociologist and a political activist. So he takes the medical model and apply it within a political context, but it doesn't lead to recognition of suffering, but actually the other way. So in his book, Anti-Bomb, Hangenbaku, Anti-Nuclear Bomb, right, it's this quote from Spinoza that is comes from the work of Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, a psychiatrist who was in Auschwitz. And he said, suffering ceases to be suffering as soon as we form a clear and precise picture of it. Right, that's Spinoza, right? So he said that the method that Frankl does was an extremely objective way to get a sense of your own struggles, right? And this is, he talks to social workers at times, so this is how you experience in case studies. The subject convinced that what you are saying is true, he or she will be able to gain a certain spiritual ground. It's kind of a very Christian idea, right, also, which will give him or her a certain insight into how to live, act, and think in the future. The subject itself is able to continue to spiritual work of trying to convert his experiences, the pain, into ideas, right? But going for a sociological work, the subject can prevent it from being carried away by the suffering, right? And able to confront the affliction and establish him or herself as a subject who can overcome it. So he basically established a political model of struggle to overcome suffering, to leave the psychiatric and psychological suffering behind through confronting the bomb and speaking openly and working against the bomb. What it leads to, and this is where I'm going to end though, is to kind of, is a kind of separation of those who are politically active and those who don't politically active. And it leads to a suspicion of trauma, which also means that up to the 90s and even beyond, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you don't have recognition of PTSD for ideological reasons, because people who do suffer are the one who are not politically active, the one who don't speak, the one who don't act, the one who are not models and inspiration for the community. And I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ran. So Ran, just to recap, Ran gave us a story about, nowadays we understand what PTSD is, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Before, when it was written into the American Psychiatric Association's manual in the year of 1973, before it existed, why did it take so long for people in Japan to recognize the condition that they were bombed, actually, right, in Hiroshima, right? So there were factors that were examined in Ran's book, right? But for Hsiu-Yun's story, that's more forward-looking. It's about application of nuclear science, right, in Taiwan. Right, it's a completely opposite direction. We retrospectively examine people's wounded psyche. But Hsiu-Yun's story is about how we're going to, it's about state development, science-led development through nuclear science, right, in Taiwan. So, Hsiu-Yun.
Because my eyes are pretty bad, so I have to be near the computer and the monitor and all that. Okay, so I've been struggling about how to deliver this. I could go pretty chatty, but I could also do it more kind of serious way, but let's see how we'll do it. Okay, I haven't decided. This is a paper I'm just trying to finish by the end of this month. And I haven't decided what's going to be the title, so I put a question mark there. The key issue is globalization, specifically globalization of isotopes. And if you read the recent studies on history of nuclear science, you mostly will find that there's this globalization of isotopes promoted by the U.S. After World War II, and isotopes quickly became globalized. But what I want to say today is I try to look at a very kind of specific example to see this is probably not a successful or a success story as one might assume. And I'm also following some scholars who have mentioned that, that there's some challenges and obstacles along the way of so-called globalization. Okay, now here's a very example. My example is the treatment of hyperthyroidism by using iodine-131. And if you know about hyperthyroidism, I'm sure some of you know, 甲状腺亢进, okay? So the reason why I got interested in this question was I had hyperthyroidism 20 years ago, and I was in the US, and I went to the doctor. The doctor offered RAI, the iodine-131, radioactive iodine. And because I was a foreigner, I felt a little bit uncomfortable, so I called home. My friends and relatives, everyone I talked to said, you should do a surgery. That's what we do here. And because they say the benefit of doing surgery is you could still leave a piece of your thyroid, and that could still function. And then I went back to my endocrinologist. I went to him, I said, how come you asked me to do this RAI? And all my friends and even physicians, they mention surgery. And he said, why do you want surgery? Surgery just got some risk. And I said, but I talked to some doctors. And he said, he went like, who did you talk to? The doctors from Taiwan I met at the conferences, they all use RAI. So that was a very interesting experience for me. And after 2003, I started looking into this. And I realized there's a sharp contrast in terms of clinical practice that in Taiwan that for some reason surgery was preferred, was the most dominant treatment option up until the end of last century. So I got curious about how this was the case. Especially if you look into the 1950s history of nuclear science, you realize there was so much push and so many ceremonies, Every time you have someone associated with nuclear science, there was this enthusiasm involved in this, and both the scientists from the US or from IAEA, the international scientific community, the nuclear scientists, and also the local scientists, they also nuclear science as the future. So now there's two layers to this enthusiasm. One is the Cold War context. Taiwan was trying to catch up. And of course, there's always the hidden agenda. They want to start nuclear science with the intention to build a bomb, right? But you can never say that because they signed a treaty with the US. It's only for civil uses, the Atoms for Peace project, okay? So I will not give you too many details, but I can tell you that the rates compared to surgery and RAI, the surgery has always been the dominant one. And so I see them as kind of competing treatments, but at the same time, they're not just clinical choices. I think it went back to colonial time. The reason why that surgery was the more dominant treatment choice was because the issue of thyroid was a very important issue during colonial time. And surgeons, they were all very interested in the issue of goiter. Let me see. Okay, I want to jump to this here. Jump to colonial medicine. This is a very well-known paper published by Kawaishi Kunio. He was a surgeon who was at the Imperial College of Tohoku Imperial University, that's now NTU Hospital. And he was one of the heads of the 2 surgical divisions. The interesting part of this is the 2 main surgical divisions, they were all interested in goiter issues in Taiwan. So they did all sorts of research, the geographic distribution, racial differences, and food, nutrition, pathology, everything. Now, you might be, if you are familiar with the modern medical system, you might be curious why this is the surgeon's domain. That's because whether or not you want, whether it's a goiter problem or hyperthyroidism, they are usually, the treatment is thyroidectomy, that is the surgical removal of the thyroid. And so these researchers, they were not just researchers, they were also clinicians. The 2 heads of the surgical departments, they were all very skillful surgeons, and they are also known for doing thyroidectomy. Okay, and they have all the, they train physicians, you know, the students who went to Tohoku Imperial University Medical College. They were all trained within these 2 surgical departments. So that after the war, the surgeons, they continue on with their research. And now I want to show you, just to add a note to this, why were these colonial physicians so interested in goiter issue? Because they saw, especially Kawaishi, he saw this as very significant for the imperial expansion of Japan, because that was right before, you know, they move on to Philippines and Southeast Asia, because they see if, you know, if we could take care of this, because you see all these problems, all these places they are trying to invade. And goiter, by contrast, was not a serious problem in Japan compared to these other places. Okay, so this is a picture, Kawaishi on the right side, and left is Gao Tiancheng, who was also a surgeon, who then became, you know, after World War II, he became the head of the NTU hospital. And the 2 had a very close relationship because of the surgical tradition, and also because Gao Tiancheng was trained in Japan. So he had sort of an intimate tie with the surgical community. And then after the war, Kawaishi continued to return to Taiwan. And because all his students are all around and doing, had all the very successful surgical practice. I just want to show you real quick. This was based on Gao Tiancheng, you know, the head of the NTU hospital. He's on his 10th anniversary at NTU hospital. He had a list of surgeons all over Taiwan, and I, you know, use a map to present this. So you can see that on the right hand side is, of course, Taipei. So Taipei has most surgeons, and on the left hand side is the map of Taiwan. You can see the distribution. And this is just the people who are associated with them. We have to, if you want to, it's not a complete representation, because we also have people who were trained in Japan and then returned to Taiwan who might not be on his list. But there was a total of 135. So it's enough for them to establish a sort of a kind of an establishment for doing all kinds of surgery. Okay, so how much time do I, okay. So now just say a comment real quickly before I move on to the globalization of isotopes is that apparently surgery was a good business, and lots of surgeons, they like to have private practice. So much so to the point by 1970s, there were all kinds of news report about surgical abuse. And the most cut out organs are uterus. This is one of my paper. That's how I got interested in this, hysterectomy. So uterus and appendix, and then thyroid. These are the number 3 most removed organs by 1970s. And there were all kinds of accusations about how, surgeon will cut out your organs even though they are fine. They don't have reason to cut them, but because, and at that time we also have the laborers insurance, which would cover, if you are in the laborers insurance, that the coverage is quite wide. Of course, it's not as much as the contemporary, the national health insurance, but it's got wide coverage. Okay, so now you could see from this abuse, you could see the extent to which how surgery was already established. Now let's return to the other side of the story is the isotopes. The funny part is when we look into this history starting from mid-1950s, you have the US, trying to push isotopes. This is a very, this comic is from Angela Krieger's book that I scanned from. And you have the sort of the experts team from the US, from US AEC. This is 1957, and they went around in Asia. They, not just Taiwan, they went to Japan and went to Philippines and Taiwan, and basically to promote isotopes. And they were involved in all kinds of ceremonies. This is the time that anything that's associated with isotopes, they were full with ceremonies, like 4 or 5 ceremonies within a year. This is the groundbreaking of the NTU isotope lab. And the local people, scientists, physicians, the elite, they saw this as very important, very critical to the nation building. We want to catch up with the world, and we want to prove that Taiwan used to call itself Free China, so Free China is the authentic, the legitimate China in that context. And nuclear science is going to help us. And some people went so far as to say that nuclear science is anti-communist. This is a quote from the Minister of Education, also the Director of Atomic Council of Taiwan. Okay, so you see all kinds of enthusiasm, basically, and all kinds of sort of advocating, the nuclear science, everything, and of course the building of the nuclear reactor at Tsinghua University was also one of the very important events at that time. So only this kind of elite, context, if you go to NTU or later on the Veterans Hospital, you will see that nuclear science is very, it was being promoted a lot. But if you look locally, just found this very specific clinical practice, you see a very different story. This is 1959, a local clinic, this Hsiu-Yun. The head of this clinic was also a student of one of the two surgical departments from the old Tohoku Imperial Medical College. So he, Xu Bangxing was the one. And he had this, I don't have too many records, but this one is from 1959. And again, you see this, his statistics from 1959, that the number one cut-out organ is appendectomy. 你会看到一个重垂眼，重垂眼就是盲肠炎 the old name. So the number one is appendectomy, and the number two is stomach. Apparently, stomach was being, people had stomach problems in the past a lot. And then number three was, again, thyroid. So that even though that, what I want to say is this development of nuclear science in Taiwan, you will see very uneven development, okay? It's, I want to compete. Okay. Okay, maybe I'll skip some details. Some of them, for example, the treatment of cancer, the introduction of cobalt-60, 钴60, seems to have taken a niche much better than iodine-131. And the reason for this, I think it's because of for various reasons. Some of them they share, but some of them they don't. Like, first of all, iodine-131 was expensive. When it was first introduced, it was as expensive as a surgery, okay? And also, it was limited in some elite institutes. It was not like all these surgical clinics all over Taiwan. And also, Taiwan did not produce its own isotopes until later on. Probably the stable supply would be late 1970s. And even for that, I look into what people use, where did they get their isotopes? I find that some of them actually got isotopes from Japan, not the locally produced, the one produced by Tsinghua University. Okay, so it's expensive and it's limited, and also it's professional niche. It's also very sort of a chaotic. You could kind of sense there's some kind of professional conflicts. There was this group of radiologists who were trained with X-rays. And they would be the sort of close people who would be doing nuclear science. But somehow they continue on with X-rays. They don't take on isotopes. But they could also move on to cobalt-60. So it has something to do with the material condition in which the physician practice. So some physicians seem to like machines, equipment. With RAI, you don't actually involve too much equipment. And that if you look into the establishment of professional societies, you realize there are two, what we call twins. But the twins, they don't get along, like one evil twin, one nice twin. There's this radiology society, and there's the nuclear science society. Two different, the two different societies, they were established in very different time period. And the first one is apparently the group who came to Taiwan from mainland China, who were trained under Hsiu-Yun, the Union Medical College in old China, who were mostly radiologists. And the other group were this more kind of recent development who started this practice after nuclear science or isotopes was introduced. So you see all this kind of conflicts and struggles and sometimes even gossip and rumors within these professional societies. And they basically don't get along with each other. So that might be one of the circumstances why iodine-131 wasn't really, didn't really take off. Okay, so I guess my time is up, so I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hsiu-Yun. Now, students might find that the stories both speakers speak on a little bit difficult to enter because these are the periods during which we are not sure about what to do with nuclear science. Nowadays, we go to a hospital, CT, MRI, we're so familiar with them, right? But this is a period that, well, nuclear science and its application is still under development. And so to make it easier for students to get themselves familiarized with the context, may I invite two speakers to just speak very roughly about what is acceptance of peaceful use of atomic energy in your context? Am I right? I mean, in Hsiu-Yun's story, that the slow acceptance of isotope therapy, you said that was a colonial legacy. People are so used to the Japanese style of surgery in treating thyroid problems. And was there resistance against nuclear science in its application in treating diseases, right? And for Ran, what was it like, local scientists or medical professionals, what was their view about peaceful use of atomic energy, predominantly in medical application?
Thank you. That just gave me an opportunity to say what I forgot. I want to sort of echo your project a little bit because one of the things that the physicians noticed, this is later on in the 1980s, some endocrinologist from NTU, apparently he accepted that iodine-131 was a good option for treating hyperthyroidism, but he noticed that many of his patients refused because they make the analogy between iodine-131 and atomic bomb. They saw that as, just a smaller atomic bomb, and they were scared of it. And also that in 1950s, there were quite a few instances, like the acid rain, the Strontian studies, that was also reported in Taiwan, and also the Japanese fishermen, bikini incident, that was also reported in Taiwan. So there was this, some people were really fearful of that, yeah, so.
Okay, so in the terms of psychiatry, so there is one chapter that I kind of actually now wish I talked about more, because my book has different places, so I will talk about this chapter, because also Hari here gave me a lot of the material from Geneva at one point. And now I'm kind of freaking out. I want to go back if I say thank you in the book or not. I think I did, but so actually you would think, so a lot of the book is about why people did not treat this as what we now think is common sense. There is a massive event of mass death and suffering, so you think doctors will be worried about the psychological health of survivors. But doctors actually was more worried in the WHO about people worrying about the effect of nuclear weapon and not panicking about it because they're worried that people are afraid of science. So psychiatrists are actually more concerned in the WHO about promoting atomic medicine and the use of atomic power, and the people that weren't accepting it were some kind of normal, and they have psychiatric issues, right? And they're too anxious, right? And there's no need to worry about medicine that use iodine or the atomic power or fallout from Bikini, because science will work everything out. And no need to worry, we have scientists, right?
Yes.
No, the belief in science in the 50s, and I think this is something that it's very hard for us. So, you know, there's a very famous saying by, I think, Tony Judd, a historian, who said that the past is a foreign country. And I always tell my students that what we think is common sense was not common sense even as early as the 50s. You don't have to go to 19th or 18th century, right? So what psychiatric science cared about in the 50s and the 60s, right? Again, the ideology, like the same way that I saw the ideology of the Japanese, either the peace movement people or the Imperial Army, in this case, the ideology of Atoms for Peace, which was an American-produced ideological kind of idea of looking at the silver lining on the atomic cloud, right? So something good must come out of it, right? So it all comes from an American idea, Atom for Peace, you mentioned, right? There was the idea that atom is not just for war, but also for peace, right? So this is this belief in science, right? It's science, we know what we're doing, right? Which, of course, then Chernobyl, Fukushima, and all those other places basically kind of destroyed. You have your own. You had two before.
Well, actually, I think that in the WHO, these scientists, they were not that confident about science. They were actually, well, in my book, I wrote an anecdote. It's about a study group, a scientist in the World Health Organization. They formed really to study the influence of atomic energy to of our psyche, our mental issues, but they had no conclusion. They had no conclusion, and soon after IAEA was established, that the study group was closed, because you know what, the WHO was, in terms of hierarchy, is lower than IAEA, because IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, it was under the Security Council, which is higher than the Social and Economic Council that oversees WHO. That's why then scientists could not really voice themselves out on this topic, right? So in my book, I saw that these scientists, they were really confused about the effect of atomic energy, right? And the reason why I asked Rand the question was because I saw a movie by Kurosawa, Akira Kurosawa. You know, that movie was so interesting. Not Ikiru, it's called I Live in Fear. Do you know that film? Yeah, right, I Live in Fear. There's a doctor who was worried in Tokyo, a doctor in Tokyo who was worried about that this is full of nuclear radiation, right, in Tokyo. And he was called by the court to testify a guy who was accused by his family that he was mad because he's so worried about the nuclear radiation in Tokyo as well. So he himself was kind of torn apart. He had that kind of belief as well, but he's going to testify that this person is mad because he believes that there's full of radiation in Tokyo. Right? So I was really thinking about culturally, right, in the 1950s, normal people or even professionals, they see nuclear energy.
Yeah, and again, I think this idea of like fear and also on the other side trying to find hope, trying to find uses of it, which is, I think, also because you often, now nuclear science doesn't have that much of a good image, right? But at the time, this was cutting edge, right? Yeah, yes. So this was seen, I don't know, how did, can I steal from you the question? Yeah. I want to,
yeah. Okay.
When Dr. Ko go to Geneva, how does he present, is it something to show that like our science is as advanced as everybody else, or is it part of kind of development idea?
The head of the NTU hospital? Oh yeah, he, you know, he was, Harry just mentioned IAEA. IAEA had at some point they were doing this standardization, you know, trying to, you know, one of the problems with globalization is you need to get every country, you know, all the labs in different countries, they have the same kind of standard. They are supposed to use, you know, more or less same kind of method and same kind of measurement. So IAEA was doing this standardization of thyroid measurements, intake, iodine 131 intake measurement. And so Gao, Dr. Gao, he did some kind of research and actually following the US scientist Marshall Bruce's method. And actually, from what I can see, he was just repeating what at that time was doing at that time. But then he went on to the second peaceful useful purposes in Geneva and present his result. And this was reported back to Taiwan as we have, you know, made it to the world, and this is a great achievement. And it also, I think that was probably fake news. He said, the news also says, you know, Dr. Gao's research had caught so much attention from the participants, and he was getting invited to European countries and America to present his results. But what he did was actually already wrong. Okay, so but it makes sense because Taiwan was trying to catch up, and I think still today we have all kinds of Taiwan Zhiguang, right? We have all kinds of the light of Taiwan. I don't know how you translate it.
The beacon of Taiwan.
Yeah, you
right.
take pride, you know, whoever can made it and show it to the world. And there's this
right.
kind of implied, you know, we've been watched by the world and we did well, we did pretty good. And so, yeah. And they did believe that if we work hard in developing nuclear science, the country is gonna get very powerful.
Yeah, and I just, I wrote also, not in the context of medicine, but in the context of nuclear power on Japan. I wrote on Atom for Peace in Hiroshima. There was a big exhibit in Hiroshima of Atoms for Peace. Actually, in the museum, they took out the atomic bomb stuff and put in Atom for Peace in 1956. And also did a lot of medicine there. And in this context, I read a book by E.T. Abraham, about the Indian, E.T. Abraham. Yeah, Abraham. About the Indian nuclear program. And he talks about Indian elite scientists as, I think it's kind of, they're always in kind of protest of like waiting and developing because they see their country always almost getting to the same development level as the other advanced countries, right? Your science is almost there always, but you never actually catch up, right? You always have very anxious about maybe you as an elite or the same level as everybody else, but then what about the rest of your country, which doesn't look exactly like it's supposed to look like the European countries. So there's this the hierarchies of science, even though we all pretend we're part of the republic of science, but especially in the 50s, the anxieties and also class anxieties of the doctors as being elite versus and maybe in your work also, right? Like the doctors being elite versus the rest of the country, right? And I guess let's go back to the colonial stuff that you talked about, right?
Yeah, very much so. Did you mention E.T.
Abraham, he's coming. He's coming to Taiwan in June.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh,
STS conference.
that would be nice. Yeah. Yeah, I read one of his articles. Yeah, that was very helpful. But did you ask a question, or you just responded?
I was referring to the colonial hierarchies.
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
like the class, the fact that those people were elite and also collaborating in a way with the Japanese, right?
Right.
Or collaborating with the Kinti. You mentioned there are different groups of elites, right?
Right.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, online people.
So speaking of elite, this is also one thing I find very intriguing is Dr. Gao. He was Taiwanese. I mean, born in Taiwan, second generation Christian from Tainan actually. And I noticed that the delegates of Taiwan, the one who went to the peaceful uses of atomic science in Geneva, all the people in that group were all mainland Chinese. And he was the only one that was born in Taiwan. That was something that's very striking for me. And I think the reason was he was a doctor, and he was in a very important position. Yeah. So it's kind of complicated.
Yeah, of course. And when you say elite, doesn't mean also that all elites are the same, right? There's competition within elites, and there's people, you mentioned scientists, there's conflict about nuclear science and psychiatry and psychology and all this stuff within establishment, right? I mean, we academics always like to fight. We always think we're right and everybody's wrong. I mean, not me, of course. But I want to ask you actually about because one thing that I barely mentioned, but maybe I should talk about more, is the relationship between the doctors and psychiatrists that are elite people trained in Germany and in imperial universities and other places, right? And their patients that a lot of them are working class. In Hiroshima, a lot of it, the class issue is very important. So people, for example, there is this disease called Bura-Bura-Bio, wavering disease. Bura-Bura is like not being able to stand up, being fatigued, being very, very tired. And it's a disease that no one could find any kind of reason for. There is no biological reason for. It's probably connected to radiation, but radiation was not understood at the time. But a lot of the people that were complaining were working class, and they couldn't go to work. They couldn't work physical labor because they had this fatigue. And there is like dismissal of this by psychiatrists and by doctors as a whole. And a lot of the language got to do with the fact those people, again, like class-laden, like those people are not taking care of themselves. They're lazy. They should really get themselves up and overcome like their problems, right? In psychiatry, it's very important. So I wonder this, when you talk about medicine, I saw there's Aboriginal people also, indigenous people also. Is there kind of a class issue here? Because surgery is very interventionist. Is there any class issue in the treatment, the preference for treatment in Taiwan?
That is a good question. I haven't noticed much. But the reason why I haven't noticed much is because it's hard to find that kind of sources to see. And I find a few case reports where they have lots of details about the patients, like, what kind of work they do and, where they came from, where they were born. But not much beyond that, and it's only a few cases. So it's not very easy to see. And especially those who show up at the NTU hospital, you could probably assume they are mostly from Taipei, urban people. And I haven't noticed any Aborigine people.
I have my own answer to Rand's question about whether or not there is a class issue in terms of goiter. In one of my research, I haven't really written it up. In the 1910s, that the Taiwanese general governor, Zong Dufu, right, asked a psychiatrist from Japan to come to Taiwan to do a survey about psychiatric disorders in Taiwan, a general survey. But the first thing that he reported was he found dwarfs, right? These people who are very short among Atayal Aboriginals, Taiyazu, right? And their problem of this kind of short stature was a result of a thyroid problem, right? Not necessarily. I don't know if it's goiter.
Result of what? Result of thyroid?
Thyroid
goiter?
problem. Thyroid goiter. Yeah. Whether or not it was goiter or not, I don't know. I didn't see the picture, right? But it was just a report. So for me, this is not much about the about class problem. It's more like a racial politics, right? It's that was at the very beginning of Taiwan's colonization, right? Yeah.
Well, could I just add quickly, in terms of the history of the disease, for a while, they didn't differentiate goiter from hyperthyroidism, because goiter itself is you could see that it's a symptom. Yeah, it's a symptom, and people who have hyperthyroidism could have that too. And some people have goiter only because of a lack of iodine. It's an iodine deficiency disease. But for hyperthyroidism, recent, I think after 1980s, they consider it as an autoimmune disease. So now that the two conditions are different. But in the early days, they didn't differentiate that. And so that I did notice a case where this is back in the time when psychiatrists and neurologists are not separated yet. So they say that hyperthyroidism is actually a kind of mental illness. That's for a while, yeah.
In the German case and German trained case, they're very, very suspicious of psychogenic, only psychological disease. They always want biological explanation for everything. So in the Japanese case, they always, if they can't find in a case of radiation, they're like, okay, so this guy is just a shirker, just lazy, yeah, he's just emotional. And usually this is kind of entangled with class issues, meaning the doctors will be always more suspicious of women, more suspicious of working class people, more suspicious of indigenous people. The hierarchies are entangled, right? Because doctors are mostly elite men, right? And their biases come into their science. But in what I wrote on, you see the entanglement of scientific education and scientific biases with quote-unquote regular biases. So power relationship, gender relationship. And I think I can see the same in your work also.
I saw that more in my hysterectomy paper more, because when what was that? A kind of IUD was introduced from the U.S. and the Taiwanese government was pushing it, but lots of women had, discomforts from using that, and this great OBGYN physician came out to say, those who don't feel it comfortable is because they have something wrong in their head. It's all in their head.
Yeah, exactly. Like when we said before, right? The psychiatrists think if you have anxiety about nuclear stuff, it's your problem, right? It's the victim. I want to see if there's audience question, but I just want to, before just conclude this section, I mentioned that the nurses, psychiatric nurses and social workers, when we talk about care or gendering, they work for an American organization, this organization called the ABCC, the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. And in there, the imperial and the class thing kind of entangled also, because it was an American establishment in Hiroshima that basically continued the same tradition of the people who were on the ground asking people how they felt, right? They view those people as resource for medical nuclear science, both the science that you deal with, biological, to a much lesser extent the science that I deal with, right? But still, again, the power relationship, it's something you can see over and over again, I think both in your paper and in my paper, and in your work also, you know, Taiwanese in the WHO, and equality, but not equality, all this stuff. So there's all sorts of hierarchies, again, entangled, I think.
Anything about your curiosity about nuclear science, the development that you can ask? Yeah, or maybe I have a lot of questions actually.
Are they allowed to speak in Chinese?
Yeah, we can translate for you if you are curious about it. If you have questions, we'll help you. 有没有我们不分系的学生 ？Yeah, please.
So I want to thank both speakers for sharing your area of expertise in nuclear science, whether it's in psychology or medicine, because I think for most of us university students that it's a period where we haven't been through. Because for us, I think the closest experience we have with nuclear is nuclear generators, yeah. And the closest incident we have memory, I think it's back in many years ago, the Japanese earthquake, where there was a leak in the nuclear generation site, yeah. But for me, coming from, because I don't have these kind of experience or been through those kind of periods, so I don't have much thoughts to share, but I still want to discuss that between the American society's view of nuclear science and Japanese society. This is coming from after I seen the film Oppenheimer, and also the Godzilla, the series, yeah, like both American and Japanese, they make their own series of Godzilla, right? But the thing I noticed between both countries is that their take of the monsters or this topic is very different. So for the American version of Godzilla, it's more focused on the awe and like the scale of the monster. And there was a film recently that was made by Japan. It's called Godzilla -1. And it talks about, like, back in World War II, the kamikaze pilot. It's about a kamikaze pilot where they were supposed to go on a mission and never come back, right? But it's focused on one pilot that did come back. And he states that his plane has a malfunction, so he was not able to complete the mission. But after the mechanics checked his plane, they found no problem with it. So what I'm implying is that he escaped from his mission. So going back to Ren's slide, I think there was one quote that says, the Japanese soldier doesn't have this kind of thoughts of fear about but they don't have this kind of training, or like in their militaries, you should complete your country's mission without your personal thoughts getting in the way, right? And I think the movie focused on more of what if the person is trying to survive and the country's mission is not someone should dedicate his life or even sacrificing his life for. And I think that is kind of interesting that you can see the difference between two countries' take on the same topic, because Godzilla is supposed to be a representation, a physical representation of a nuclear fear, where it's something that people cannot see physically, but they put it into a physical form, so we can all have thoughts for it and discuss about it. And I think back in America, like in the 1960s or so, where they view nuclear energy as this of futuristic and magical source of power, and every product was being advertised for like it's radioactive. They even put radium into like dishes so it'll glow in the dark. I think it was something like that. So I think it's interesting that we can see both sides of take on this topic, nuclear science, where one country is more of a view as more of an omniscient source, and where it shows it's a generation of fear, but the other country thinks it's this kind of futuristic energy source. I mean, this is just my take, so it's not representative of everyone, but I just find it interesting where you can see from media depiction or movies, these two sides of view for atomic energy. Yeah. Justin.
Very interesting point, but this is not a question, right? Is it? No. Do you want to respond? Yeah.
Sorry, it's a very interesting observation, and it shows the cultural aspects of science, which I think that's something that we talked about before, that it's something that we forget sometimes when we do history of science, that science also is very symbolic. Regardless of what happened in the science itself, you have to think that science symbolizes many things for many people. And science always, there is this idea, at least in Western society, that scientists, especially after the bomb, right, that scientists can be either evil scientists that do good, that do bad, right, or be good scientists that do evil. And there's kind of this like Manichean kind of idea of like good or evil. And this is where nuclear science comes, right? Atom for Peace. That you know the Disney movie about Atoms for Peace? There's Disney. Have you seen it?
What movie?
There's a the Disney company made a movie about Atoms for Peace.
I never realized it.
Yeah, there are a couple actually, and
Okay.
it shows the same kind of contrast you show, but in a very simplistic way. You know, the stories of a genie coming out of the bottle, and we have to, and stuff like this, right? Well, it's all black and white.
Talking about this symbol, I mean, as a historian, for teaching purposes, I use a lot of British Pathé documentaries that are placed online on YouTube. And if you see the British Pathé's take on Asia Pacific's first reactor of atomic energy, that was in Tsinghua University in Taiwan, right? The narrator was very famous voice actor who acted Superman for ABC channel, right, in America, right? So this is full of sympathy. It's all about superpower, about human enhancement in the 1950s. Yeah.
I think something he mentioned is quite interesting. Wang covered this many phases of science, but I think I could probably respond to what you say, that there's sometimes this conflict between the state's interest and the individual's interest. What you mentioned is quite interesting. I think depends on who you are. Sometimes, for the elites or scientists, they could sort of write on that, if you have a big project or you've got resources, and some of the elites, if they were able to find a position within that project, then they are sort of, they share the same interest at that point, right? Somehow. But the example you gave is, if you are a soldier and your country wants you to, take a plane to hit something, and, you could complete your mission, but at the same time, by doing that means that you're gonna die, right? So then in that kind of scenario, you are kind of, there's a big conflict that we can see there. So there are all kinds of different scenarios where the individual's relationship with the state could be very different.
Yeah, and I think in Oppenheimer, it's a very American film, of course, it's about American, but it's about the scientist both as hero, but also conflicted hero, right? He's not the soldier, the scientist, not a soldier that obey orders.
He's in a very safe place.
It's a very safe place. There's the genre of very, I don't want to get into the weeds in this, on analyzing the movie, but he did develop the bomb, and felt bad about it, so. But still, it did do what was told eventually, right? So there's a lot of problematic with this film, but it shows, on one hand, it shows how conflicted he was. He was a human being after all, right? On the other hand, it shows the scientist as a hero, right? Which is a very old genre.
I'm a professor in psychology department. I study MRI, and my name is Junjia. And I actually come here to hear more about psychological science aspects of what the title. Yeah, but I actually wrote down some of my reflections and comments and questions also. But I guess I'd like to share some. I'll just name what I wrote down. When the first speaker talked about the Hiroshima professor and clinicians, the psychiatrist to do the survey, I remember in my field, there's also famous psychiatrist whose name is Hsiu-Yun. He's also the chair of the Taiwan Psychiatry Association, I guess past 5-10 years ago. In Taiwan in 1998, there was a famous earthquake in Nantou County. And soon after the earthquake, many people came there to try to do something. And he shared a memory of, I remember it was like supernatural to him, because he saw many people just, like lying there, doing nothing, stare at the sky, but just like sitting there in the open, like assembly house. Because recently Taiwan also underwent another earthquake again in the east. And he tried to do some survey as well. And the question, just like the one that you listed, how do you feel? And do you like to see psychiatrists and something like that? And he was leading several colleagues there, and he saw it as like a supernatural because he saw many dumped questionnaires on the ground. Nobody cared. People were like busy rescuing and just lying and just so chaotic. And he was like, why was he there? but yeah, that was like soon after the feeling that he shared. But he still managed to do a lot of questionnaires. And I guess there are definitely publications later afterwards. Yeah. So the definition of that DSM, diagnostic manual of a statistical manual of psychiatry, or this has now is like 5th, and also the corrected version, right? When was the PTSD start to surface? I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist. I teach in the psychology department, so like everybody, like general psychology. But I guess that's, how should I call it? I got your point about the book. I guess you try to convey the idea that if this idea is not ever present, PTSD was not present at that time, so people got the idea, but there's no category at that time, so they don't know, or they just went over it. They just like did whatever they're supposed to do, because there was no such category at that moment. I'm not sure if I got you right.
Yeah. Sorry, if I understood you correct. So there's two questions, I guess, here. Let me start with the PTSD. So PTSD in Japan basically arrived in Japan post the Kobe earthquake, right? Kobe earthquake, 1995. They start to have the idea of kokoro no kizu, which is wounds of the heart. And this is post 1995. And this is when they start to use it more generally. As late as the late 80s, even though the category exists in America, people in Japan don't use it, and you find researchers doing research on earthquake, accident victims, and also hibakusha, atomic bomb victims, and don't use the category. They use different categories, and as I said, because they use different categories, the scientists understand it differently, right? They don't understand it as PTSD. They understand it through either political, ideological, cultural, or through biological reasons, right? Fatigue and the like, right? And especially with radiation, people don't know what is the exact impact of radiation. There's a lot of things that are still not understood. So just general radiation disease, they don't know, right? So they're not understood, and also, again, the patients experience this, and this is something that it's very hard in medical science, because we deal with the doctors, because the doctors leave us documents. But as you said in your work, we don't have the patients. We don't know how the patients experience. We also, a lot of time, right? We know what the doctors wrote about the patients, but we can't go, and we should go and find the patients, and right? But with psychiatry is a problem, because how can I go and ask someone how you felt 50 years ago, right? The people at the time, and let's go to the second question, right? So before PTSD, it's hard for us to get to how people actually experience. I argue they didn't experience as PTSD, because I'm agnostic. I don't say I know how they did. We don't have the empirical knowledge and the ability to.
Yeah.
So that's the first part. Yeah, go ahead.
So I agree, and I just, my point is that I guess this is probably not uncommon in the medical history, because I remember in World War I, there's a symptom called shell shock, right? And the symptoms are very similar, right? And also there's some brain damages, but it's World War I time. And yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned it. I was thinking about it, but I wonder if the people who experience shell shock and the people who experience the bomb in Hiroshima or Nagasaki are the differences might not be similar, because shell shock, you see bloody, body being kind of smashed, and it's very bloody, and it's quite shocking. But atomic bombs, some they do see it, but some might not so visible.
Yeah, so shell shock, of course, means there is a shock wave from the shell that cause biological differences, right? So it's biological explanation. So if you rest and your body, and you are rested, and there's no treatment for this, right? But if you rest and you're going to go back, so you should be okay. And if not, it's your problem. And the same thing with the victims of the atomic bomb, because there's no reason for you to be anxious, and you should just feel better if you rest, stuff like that. Now, I want to go back to the bomb and how the psychiatrists that walk around and ask questions. There's a couple of problems, and I want to afterwards hear more about this, maybe afterwards, but because it's very interesting for me. Psychiatry is always like 5th, 6th, 7th priority. You know, people, as you said, they want to rescue, they want to take care of like broken limbs, or people don't care about psychiatry until much later, right? So, and second of all, there's a very big difference between the doctor you mentioned, sorry, I didn't catch the name, and those people who walk around. Because those people walk around, and most researchers in Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not care about the victims. They did not want to help the victims. They wanted to see if the bomb caused the shock, the psychological shock. What psychological shock? Because they wanted to understand what would be the impact on America. They don't care about the victims in Japan. They're doing it because they're military doctors that want to do military research to see how do bombs work psychologically on the population, and what can we do to help Americans? Again, not to help Japanese. So that's a very big difference, because the doctor you spoke of, and again, I'm sorry, I forgot, I didn't catch the name, wanted to help people, which is very, very big difference, right?
Professor Gong, you have not some
Oh,
other questions?
just the point of the point that I caught your book, that the idea was the phenomena was similar, but the category, the idea was not even mature enough that everybody knows. That kind of symptom, that kind of phenomena, I have actually several experiences of. One is the overgeneralization of ADHD. I guess maybe not ADHD, but autism, Asperger's syndrome. There's a prevalence rate or estimate of 5 to 15% in pretty much everywhere. But I guess it's funny that after our ex-mayor, Taipei, who claimed himself to be Asperger, many people consider, oh, this is Asperger, then I have some kind of Asperger. If you listed the 9 checklist of ADHD, you probably will find yourself nearly ADHD. Yeah. Because once you know, oh, there's so many checklists that I fit, and many people consider they might be falling in between the category. So the idea of common like diagnosis like spreading, people feel themselves falling into that category. I guess this is probably common symptom. Yeah.
This is looping effect. This is looping effect by Ian Hawking, right?
And there's another point that I like to ask about the, actually this is Professor Wang's question. You mentioned the symptom of iodine and the surgery. Actually, that was very interesting. I have a recent observation about the psychiatrist's popularity recently to TMS,
transcranial
magnetic stimulation. In recent decade became pretty popular, I was told, because I checked the website about the clinics using this. I remember in 10 years ago, the medical literature still have mixed results. So they're not very, how do you call it, embracing or like populating this kind of, but now it's like there are already clinics saying they're like over 60% and it's very, useful and blah, blah, blah. So I don't know about who decide, like you could do this, or is like a, so-called hearsay. You hear other people have some kind of testimony and you spread the knowledge, and then people start to use, oh, this is good, and people can start sharing their experiences. Another example I like to ask about is the recent example in Tainan, Yuguangdao. There's an island there. They will settle down the cell phone how do you call the transmission tower? They like it to relocate because of the concern about the
Radiation?
safety. Yeah. But the medical literature has suggested there's no long-term accumulation of those radio frequencies. But people's concerns still persist. Yeah. I'd like to hear about your thoughts.
I want to ask if Professor Gong wants to join our STS society. Yeah, I mean.
I didn't get the first question you made. Did you say who gets to decide to do surgery? Well,
get popularized. What was the common? But because to me, there's no like formal procedure of like, okay, now there's a medical science paper, and then everybody should do this, and then everybody follow. But I guess hearsay, testimony, or I guess this is probably more popular.
I think this could be a complicated question because it depends on if you're the patient or you seeing it from the patient's point of view, or you are a practitioner, you are the surgeon or the physician, you could have very different concerns. And I have seen one case, this patient who actually she had hyperthyroidism, but at first she accepted surgery, and somehow it didn't work. She had surgery twice, and eventually she took the iodine 131. So you could see this if you looking at this individual case, you realize that there is some kind of priority that it's been, that she sees that, okay, I'll do the surgery because I don't know. She didn't explain why, but it seems to be that was the common thing. That's what people do. But then eventually it didn't work, and she had to use the RAI. Oh, surgery?
No, it's not surgery.
Oh, shock? Okay.
It's not electric shock. It's something. Oh, okay. Right. It's brain stimulation. Deep brain stimulation.
Okay.
Right.
Well, I think, I guess it's easier for me to explain this if I try to take the patient's point of view. Patient would try to, first of all, they would, depends on the people around them, what people do, they would tend to use that. And then if it doesn't work, then they would try other options. And there's also considerations. For example, I have heard this case who accepted radioactive iodine only because he was afraid of surgery. And so, you have people who are afraid of surgery, but you also have people who are afraid of radiation, and they would have different choices. But I think it's complicated because it depends on what kind of knowledge they have and what kind of medical resources they have access to. So it could get very complicated, in terms of, what they end up doing. Yeah. So that's the most I can do.
I don't have any explanation about TMS and iodine, but I just think in this patient-doctor issues, especially when it comes to, and again it goes back to the question about class we talked about before. So in my case, the case studies used to look at the charts of the doctor. Of a lot of time, the patients see their psychiatric problems through religious lens. People are possessed. People are paying for sins. And the doctors and nurses totally dismiss it. Again, there's a class issue, right? they're superstitious. They should just believe in science and they have nothing wrong with them and all this stuff. So this patient, sometimes the doctors impose disease or impose lack of disease on the patients that have different understanding of the world. So there's different epistemologies in place between patients and doctors.
Soon we'll have to close the panel, but before I close, maybe I can respond to Professor Gong's question or comments, because this is entirely my area of the history of trauma. I mean, I don't know if you know Hisao Nakai, that the Japanese psychiatrist who commented a lot on PTSD in Japan, that one of his explanation about the delayed recognition of trauma-related issues in Japan was that before 1995, the Kobe earthquake, well, a lot of psychiatrists trained in Japan, they were trained under the context of militarism, right? And well, it's roughly about that in 1995. Also, this is because of the crisis. Second, it's because all these psychiatrists trained in militarism, they died off, right? And then so this kind of recognizing that we Japanese, we could psychologically be injured. That kind of paradigm began to emerge, right? This is one of his explanation. And then in this book, published 2 years ago, I actually had a chapter about how psychiatrists working for the Imperial Taihoku University, pre-NTU, right, went down to do a survey of earthquake victims in 1935 in Holi, right, in Holi, 大地震. And it was so interesting that when they did their survey, they had all their categories of symptoms, and they kind of observed that Taiwanese people, after the earthquake, they could not piss and poo. And they kind of reasoned that, they say, oh, this is because their autonomic nerves were affected by the tropical climate, right? So, yeah, it's all about class elite and also the then popular kind of tropical medicine, right? Anyway, we kind of delayed for 5 minutes. We have 2 minutes. But if you don't have any question, yeah, do you have any final words? Right. Right. No one? Right. So actually, we open up a lot of areas that are worth, I mean, we can really talk more. We talk about the politics of diagnostics, politics of therapies, on top of all these important issues, and still remaining close scrutiny. And so, you're trying to say? Yeah.
I just want to say thank you. I learned a lot. I want to thank you for giving the talk, and thank you for the questions and for your comments and for people that listening. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Say the same too. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being here. And I learned a lot from your talk in front of the audience.
Our broadcast will remain online, right? So if you just feel free to share the footage to people you feel that they might be interested in. Okay, thank you.